Hey everybody, this is the first of three videos that I am making to follow up on some modules you've done. The module on W.E.B. Du Bois, the module on George Herbert Mead, and the module on structural functionalism. At that point, once you're done with that module, and that should be module 7, please stop and review the material. Originally on the syllabus it says that we're going to go through module 9. This isn't the case. You need some time to we had the ice storm, it's all over, spring is upon us, and we are I'm going to divide the material up between modules 1 through 7, which should get us through structural functionalism. Today, or in this module, we're going to discuss W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, his name is spelled, and it's not pronounced Dubois. That would be kind of a French pronunciation. It is pronounced Du Bois. This is a noteworthy titan of intellectual and activist life in the 20th century. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. He was an outspoken advocate for Pan-Africanism, and indeed, just as we look at people like Marcus Garvey and so forth as kind of active founders of this movement, he really, Du Bois laid the intellectual groundwork for both a Pan-Africanism and later a sort of a Marxist interpretation of race and racism in America and its economic consequences. He became more left-wing as he got older, and was lived to about 1963, where he died in Ghana, the newly independent Ghana under Nkrumah was the president of Ghana. And he was an outspoken advocate of Marxism, the Soviet Union. He had you see a picture in your text of him with Mao Zedong. He was an outspoken advocate for the non-white or non-aligned peoples of the world, and again he became more aligned with communism and more of a internationalist toward the end of his life. But we want to talk a little bit today about, and he also had some other noteworthy contributions. He was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He studied in Berlin with Max Weber, and indeed, were it not for the pervasive racism in academia at the time, he would have been much more earlier received and recognized as one of the major intellectuals of the 20th century. In terms of his ongoing effect and his lasting questions, they're still quite potent 111, 113, 120 years after he did his original work. These are questions which are still very salient today. So if that's the test of an idea, his ideas are very, very powerful and have a lot of currency even today in 2014. So why, though, some people ask, do we include why do we include Du Bois in a theory text? Well, first off, this is the first in-depth treatment of a specific phenomenon, that's race, as both a subjective lived experience for not only blacks but whites as well, and others of course, but I mean he's just dealing with the racial tableau of the eastern United States and the southern United States in the early 20th century, which is a story about blacks and whites. So race is a subjective lived experience for whites as well as blacks. That's a key point that he makes, and it's a quintessential epistemology. What does that mean? It's a word that essentially is a study of how we know what we know. Well, in terms of race, racism, and the mythologies and pseudoscience that are based around race, there's 2 centuries worth of kind of, we might call, false consciousness epistemology. And Du Bois, 115 years ago, lays the groundwork for, debunking what we now know to be scientifically from looking at molecules and genes and how people are descended from one another. We now know to be the race is a completely bankrupt idea in terms of biological science. It is very real, and it must be pointed out. It is very, very, very real, though, in 2014 in the way that it is socially constructed. And the terms of that construction are always, more powerful groups always have the sort of upper hand in this. The racism that dominated American sociology did indeed keep him from being recognized as a pioneer. Du Bois, your book places people, and you'll see this on in figure. Let me see which page it is on. When we look at figure 7.1 on page 266, please review that. Du Bois is indeed has a collective standpoint, and he's coming from a non-rational perspective. But he did intertwine structural, and that's collective, as well as subjective or non-rational or individual elements as well. He's best known, and the reason he's assigned sort of a collective non-rational position by Scott Appleroot and Laura Eddles is because his major work, the work that influences research and theoretical constructs to this day and still very powerfully, is his work on racial consciousness. He did write some rational books, but they were basically empirical analyses, economic analyses of the free and slave colonies, which became the 13 states, for example. His primary contribution is one of consciousness, and he talks about the fact that racial consciousness motivates particular lines of actions. He wrote about how racism is entrenched in the American psyche, kind of the collective psychological mind, as well as on the rational front in economic arrangements and social institutional arrangements that serve, as these arrangements always do, to concentrate resources advantageously for one group, in his work, whites, while systematically denying resources to another group. In his early work, it would be African Americans, and later he included this to mean all non-white groups, all people of color. So in your readings for this section on W.E.B. Du Bois, your first readings is Soul of Black Folk, and that introduces us to a powerful idea, again, which still has major explanatory power in 2014, 111 years after it was written. I mean, he introduces three powerful concepts. Number one, the color line. This is a rational explanation of why race as a concept emerges and continues and perseveres. It was economically beneficial for the European colonial powers of the 15th century, with colonization and super exploitation of local populations of color in Africa and elsewhere on the one hand, and slavery in the Americas on the other. Number two, the color line has non-rational explanations, that is, subjective ones. In the Souls of Black Folk, one of his major opuses, the term double consciousness means this: whites don't have to negotiate their everyday life thinking about their race. I mean, in fact, based on the work of many contemporary critical race theorists, Bonilla Silva, one of is a major one. He expands on this idea. They expand on this idea. Whites don't consider themselves a racial ethnic category, but they consider themselves extra-racial because of racism and its embeddedness in the U.S. Other groups do and are forced to do so. In other words, a person who's African American is reminded of their race and must constantly keep it in the background. Well, a white person could go for days, months, years without ever being reminded of their race. Based on this, Du Bois describes what he terms the veil of social distance between dominant whites and all other groups. In this respect, there's a fairly solid comparison, and I want you to make this link in your mind, that can be made between Du Bois' double consciousness and the veil, and Simmel's description of the other as a social archetype. Finally, in the last reading that we in which we're treating the work of Du Bois, The Souls of White Folk, Du Bois reverses this gaze, not discussing how African Americans must live in American society as a problem, but lays the epistemological groundwork for consideration still ongoing and still very current of the social construction of whiteness. White is not a scientifically verifiable category any more than black is. However, because of the power of some groups to define these terms and use race as what's called a marker, they're very real in their consequences. They're very, very, very real, and race has been constructed in this manner over centuries. So we have this legacy of racism that's not only individually experienced, but is built into social institutions. And that's Du Bois's fundamental and central insight. Thanks.